Good evening. I have mentioned to you before that there are several times when I get up to talk about something, I think to myself, do I really want to do this? Because honestly, I would be much better at preaching on obliviousness than awareness. I am too often the guy that doesn't recognize the things that are going on around me. I was thinking of this week, actually, when I read a story online, and it was a wife who was posting an ongoing story of wondering how many days it would take for her husband to realize they had two cats in the house. And she had found two black cats that were stray out there, and she brought them in and was feeding them and had little cat toys and everything. And she said, it's been 2 days and he hasn't said anything yet. And she couldn't decide if he hadn't noticed or was just kind of shaking his head, moving on with life. But her assumption was he hadn't noticed yet. There were actually animals in the house. And I think sometimes I can be this way. I think of, I've mentioned to you before, we will hear so many sounds of little ones in our church. And I'm always blessed by that and enjoy that. A little terrified at times when Trevin and Anna were sitting behind us this morning. And there were too many happy baby sounds coming from behind us, and I was concerned my wife would leave wanting to find a baby somewhere. But we love all the little kids, and every now and then I will say something like, yeah, I remember those times, and my wife will kind of look at me like, no, you don't. You remember being in the same building, but you don't remember what it was like to try to keep people entertained for an hour or any of that kind of stuff. And she will tell me about the number of times where something was happening, and she would look at me, and I was just reading the Bible or paying attention or in another world or wherever I may be, having no idea of the thing that was going on right there. I tend to be a little unaware at times. And when I think of awareness, the first thing that comes to mind for me is Jason Bourne. I don't know if you've ever watched any of those movies, The Bourne Identity and those different movies, or read the books. But Jason Bourne is kind of this super spy guy who does not realize who he is because he's lost his memory. And at one point early in the first movie, there's a scene where he's played by Matt Damon, if I remember right. He's played by Matt Damon. He's sitting in a diner across from this person, and he's trying to explain to her that he has all these abilities that he doesn't know where they came from or why he has them. And he was talking about being aware of where he's at. And she's like, well, everybody's aware. And he said, you don't understand. I could tell you the license plate numbers of all 11 cars in the parking lot. I could tell you the quickest 3 exits from the building. I can tell you that that guy sitting over there at the diner counter is wearing a gun, even though he's trying to hide it. I could tell you, and he just lists off all these things that he knew, that he had this full awareness of everything going on around him. And the movies are kind of a series of that. I'm not giving you the preacher okay to go watch all the Bourne movies here, because you'll probably find something in there that's not good. But he is hyper aware within everything that he does. And I think we kind of tend to balance somewhere between the two, of either completely oblivious to what's going on around us, or maybe a little too aware of things at some times. And so when we think of awareness tonight, there are a lot of different ways we could look at it. But what I want you to see as we begin is, as we've begun all of these, with the Webster definition. And Webster looks at a lot of the synonyms of synonyms. Sorry, I have cinnamon on the mind. My son had a sopapilla today at lunch. Synonyms of awareness and what they mean to us. So first of all, having or showing realization, perception, or knowledge of whatever it may be. So you're kind of aware, you have knowledge of whatever's going on. Secondly, it implies vigilance in observing or alertness in drawing inferences from what one experiences. And this is probably one of the places awareness really comes into life for us, is when you experience something, and then based on that, the next time you experience the same thing, you kind of anticipate a little bit of what it's going to be like. I remember for the first time going on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride with my kids at Disney World, and remembering very well that I don't like drops on rides, and I knew it was coming. And it was every bit as bad as I remembered when I got to it again. And if you've ever ridden it, it's nothing, by the way. But when I got to it, the whole time in the ride, I couldn't enjoy anything about the ride because I knew the drop was coming. So you have this alertness about things. It implies that one is focusing one's attention on something or is even preoccupied by it. And again, this can be a positive and a negative, can it? If you go to Chili's for lunch, and you were there with another person at your table, sometimes it's hard, especially on Sundays with all those football games, if you're a guy, to get your full attention on the people you were there with. And so you get preoccupied with something else. Or sometimes, do you ever hear that really annoying sound that no one else has noticed, and then you can't hear anything other than that? For a little while, we had a ring on one of the microphones, probably the first year I was here, and no one else could hear it except for me, I think. And it drove me crazy, and I thought, I've got to find that somehow and do something. We all have things like that we get preoccupied either in a positive way or in a negative way. It also implies direct or intuitive perceiving, especially of intangibles or of emotional states or qualities. So we might think of that in terms of perception, or maybe we'd use the term intuition. You can see something about someone else. You're the first one to pick up on something's wrong here. There's something going on and they need to talk about it, or maybe they're holding something back. And so you have kind of perception about it. So some other words we might think of as we think of this biblically, beyond awareness, watchfulness. We'll find that a lot more in Scripture than I think if you look up awareness in Scripture, you may not even find it. But you will find watchfulness or be aware mentioned quite a bit. Vigilance. So we're aware and alertness, and being able to act on those things, or attentiveness. And again, it's like I have made a list of things I don't do well. These are all things that are a struggle for me. So much so, by the way, I think sometime in the later part of this series, you'll get either alertness or attentiveness. I haven't decided which one yet. But we will talk about some of these concepts again, specifically how they deal with other people. We'll hit that a little bit tonight, but not in a whole lot of detail. So what does the Bible teach about awareness? And again, you won't find the word awareness much, but you'll find a lot about watchfulness, being aware, keeping on guard, that kind of thing. First of all, we need to be aware of threats or dangers within ourselves. A lot of the struggles we have, we want to blame on other people around us or blame on situations, but sometimes those things come from within, and if we're more aware, we can work on those things. In Proverbs chapter 4, in verse 23, the wise man says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." So oftentimes when you say, well, where did that come from? Where did that action I did, where did that thing I said, where did that come from? Too often, it's from inside. I found myself on the way from here to lunch today being impatient as I was driving my car, because that's what I do. And I thought to myself as I was driving along, why do I care? Why does it matter? Why? And even more so probably when I was driving back from my house to the church office today, was having some of that too. It's worse, I've noticed, when it's just me in the car. And so it's not the people who are with me in the car that are causing it. It may or may not involve the other people that are driving or not driving well around me. Too often it's me. It's coming from within. I'm letting the impatience, I'm letting whatever it is take root. And so the proverb writer here says, be aware of what's going on inside, where this stuff is all coming from. And as we are aware, this, by the way, is the other part of all of this. It's one thing to be aware, to notice. It is another thing to put that notice and awareness into action. It's kind of like the difference between knowledge and wisdom that we talked about this morning. We have to not just notice those things, but then act based on the thing that we've noticed. Secondly, be aware also of threats from the outside. Now these, we probably are a little more aware of the idea that there are threats from the outside, but too often we don't notice them until we have a problem on our hands. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, Peter says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Now, if we were all sitting here tonight and a lion started its way down the aisle, I don't think I would have to tell you. If you didn't notice right away, I guarantee you someone near you did, and then you would see as everyone kind of begins to turn and look this direction, and then try to decide, what am I supposed to do when it's a lion? I know you play dead when it's a bear. What do I do when it's a lion? Do I back up slowly? Do I make eye contact? Do I not make eye contact? We would have all these different reactions to it. Satan is a little more covert than that. And so Peter says, be aware that the adversary is out there, and the adversary is at work, and constantly trying to get us off track, constantly trying to move us away from where we want to be. And most of the time when we fall into sin, when we fall into temptation, when we fall into what Satan has out there, a lot of times it's because we're just not paying attention. We're not noticing, we're not thinking, we're just doing and not thinking and being aware the way that we need to. Also, we need to be aware of our weaknesses. Now, for a lot of us, we probably like to just hide from our weaknesses and ignore our weaknesses, but we know we have them, don't we? We don't like it necessarily when people point them out. We don't like it when they're obvious. But deep down, we still know that they're there, and so we need to be aware of them. In Matthew 26, Jesus says, "Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And so he warns his disciples, I understand what you want to do. I understand what you think you can do, but understand that the flesh is still there and the flesh is weak. And so for each of us, even though we feel like what we want to do is follow Jesus, what we want to do is do the right things, say the right things, act in the right way, we also know that there are places where we fail at that. I mentioned to you driving for me already, impatience that comes up there in driving. Where it was a little easier for me at times is depending on who's in the car. And sometimes I would think, well, I need to keep up appearances here because someone is in the car and I can't be impatient while they're here. And I will do the right thing. I need to be aware all the time. Do we act in a different way when people are watching and when they're not? And Jesus would say to us, be alert, be aware, because those are the times where the flesh is going to be weak. Or if you know there is a situation, there are particular people that when you're around those people or in those places that bad things happen and you make poor choices, then can you make the choice on the front end to not put yourself there? To not be around those people that drag you down, to not be in the places where you make wrong choices, instead to be aware of all of that, instead of hiding from it, and then to act in wisdom based on that. There were, as I was growing up, 2 or 3 people that went to my school that I loved hanging around with. They were a lot of fun, but if I ever got in trouble in school, it was with one of those 2 or 3 people. Now, I know that there are probably some growing up things with all of that, and you probably have great friendships that were built that way too. But so often, there are people that we probably just do better to be careful when we're around those people. And so Jesus would say, be watchful. The flesh is weak. Also, be aware of sin. And I don't want to just think in generic terms of, okay, sin is bad, we don't want to sin. You know what the sin issues are for you. And our tendency too often as Christians is to look at other people who have a different kind of sin problem than we do and think to ourselves, I just can't even understand people like that. Why would anybody fall into that temptation? Why would anybody do that sin? That doesn't appeal to me at all the while having a whole different sin problem of our own that, quite honestly, that person could probably look at us and say the same thing. God doesn't want us to worry so much about what someone else's sin is versus ours. He wants us to be aware of the sin problem altogether and what we need to do. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So here, he picks out an individual sin, covetousness. And I would imagine within the room, we probably have a dividing line here of those who really struggle with something like this and those who are pretty content with what you have, and you don't worry about wanting somebody else's stuff. But he could have listed off any number of sins here that would be those same kinds of dividing lines. Each of us has something, or for too many of us, a whole list of somethings. And are we aware of those things and trying to do what we can to change how we act in those situations? Also be aware that sin and temptation are not just someone else's problems. Now, we alluded to this a little bit already, but too often we will look at the sins of others and forget about the fact that we have an issue with sin ourselves. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, Paul says, "If anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted." So Paul says, there's a time where you as a church will see something that's going wrong and you need to be able to go out and correct and to help to rebuke and to help draw them back into the right relationship with God. But in the midst of all of that, don't forget, you're susceptible too. There are things that you deal with too. There are things that you are not doing in the right way too. And so don't forget that sin is not just something that someone else does. I can remember vividly being a college student, learning about Bible as a Bible major, and hearing about different sin problems that people had fallen into and thinking to myself, what kind of person does those things? 19-year-old Brian who had it all figured out. Regular people do those things. It's not just people whose lives are a complete mess. It's not people who make the wrong decisions all the time. It's people who are tempted by something and make a bad choice and another bad choice and find themselves in a situation where sin is surrounding them. And so we need to be aware that sin is our problem too. Also be aware of your words. If I have not hit your toes yet now, I'm probably jumping up and down on top of them at this point. What we say matters. And that is at every age level, anybody we're talking to. When I dealt with teenagers when I was a youth minister, our big issue was just kidding. Somebody would say the cruelest thing you could imagine and then tag on the end of it, just kidding, as if that removed everything that had just been said. And I just wanted to shake them. Can't do that as a youth minister, by the way, I learned. Never shook them. Just wanted to shake them because I'm so frustrated. How can you talk to each other that way? How can you be like that with one another and feel like it's okay? But we don't really grow out of that, do we? We say cutting things about people. You say something about someone else, and if that person happened to walk in the room as you were saying it, how would you feel? How would they feel if it got back to them that you had said it? Or even as we argue with one another or disagree with one another, how many times have you said something that you thought immediately, I shouldn't have said that? How many times with the people you love the most have you said something that you just thought, oh, if I could just take those words back? We have to be aware of our words. In Psalm chapter 141 and verse 3, the psalmist says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Love that imagery. The idea that there is such a danger here that what we need is God to keep guard over it. Because too often, this thing that could be used for such good and for sharing the gospel and for encouraging and building up, too often we use it for the whole opposite end of the spectrum from that. In verse 4, he says, do not let my heart incline to any evil, to busy myself with wicked deeds, in company with men who work iniquity, and let me not eat of their delicacies. I don't want to be anything about these things. I don't want my words, my actions, anything to go in the direction away from God. And then also be aware not just of our words, but be aware of God's words. We have to put this rein on our words and get them in the right direction. And one of the best ways we can do that is to fill our minds with the Word of God. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, the Hebrews writer says, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. How many times have you found yourself thinking, I knew better than that? I knew what I should have done and I did something else instead. If we continue to learn, continue to do the right things, continue to keep His Word at the forefront of our minds, then we can be more of who He wants us to be. And then we need to be aware of God's presence in a number of ways, by the way. Maybe there's a little piece of this that is the reminder that God is watching what we do, that should drive us toward the right thing. Maybe there's a piece of this that is a reminder that we are not alone because God is with us. God is always here, and so often I forget. I forget that He's here with me and that I'm not on my own. The psalmist in Psalm 130, verses 5 and 6 says, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in His word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. I'm waiting on God. I just love the fact that He's here. The psalmist will later say, where can I go from your presence? He is here with us. And then be aware in prayer. We talk so much about prayer as kind of being the beginning and the end and the middle of everything that we do. But prayer is one of those ways that we are aware of God's presence in our lives. Paul in Colossians 4:2 says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it, being aware in it with thanksgiving. We are being aware through our prayer, and one of the ways we connect that here is by being thankful in the midst of that. And then also be aware of your example. Now, this is one of those things that when we are setting out to be an example, when we're in one of those modes where we're doing church things and God things, we kind of see this. What we forget about is there are people who are watching us all the time. I can't tell you how many times as my kids were small and growing up that I would say something or do something and I would see a repetition of that by one of them, and I would think to myself occasionally, oh, that's really cool, I'm glad they learned that. And then other times I think to myself, oh no, they got that from me. And now I'm going to have to spend a year correcting that because I taught it to them in the first place. I forget that I can be an example both for good and for bad. So I have to be more aware of that. Later in Colossians 4, chapter 4, verse 5, he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. What does it mean to walk in wisdom? We've already seen knowledge and wisdom pop up with this a few times. The things we do daily, are we living wisely? Is it not a matter of how much can I do and not sin, but what is the wise thing to do in this situation? How can I walk in such a way that people will see more of God and less of me? How can I walk in such a way that if they don't know Him, they'll want to know more about him? Or how can I walk in such a way that if they know I'm a follower of his, they think to themselves, well, if that's what being a follower of his is, that's a good thing. I want to do that. So we walk in a way that's wise, because we also are being aware of our opportunities. Opportunities from God come our way pretty much every day, I think. I think God places people and situations in front of us where we can represent him, where we can help others, where we can do good things. And so often we forget, or we don't notice, or we find ourselves, like me, oblivious a little too often. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, we referenced this verse a few weeks back. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. But listen to what the next verse says. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So as we have opportunity, we're going to do good. So then the question is, well, if we're not doing enough good to grow weary of doing good, as Paul warns us about in the previous verse, do we think it's because God is not giving us the opportunities to do good? Or do you think it's because we're not noticing them? Do you think it's because we don't see what God has placed before us and we're not aware of the people and the situations he's put us in and what we can do in those times? And then also on the negative side, and we'll finish these here and then move into a couple of Bible stories about this, there are consequences of being unaware. Now, my friend Mike Ireland, who came and spoke for us on a Wednesday night this summer, I was the youth minister while he was the preacher for 10 years. One of the things I picked up on that he would preach about that I've always appreciated is he would talk frequently about how there is a set of criteria, just some truths of life when it comes to regular not church life stuff that we understand just to be true. That if you do this, this is going to happen. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. Your dentist, if you go to your dentist and you have a whole lot of cavities or whatever, most likely your dentist will ask you questions about how often you brush or how often you floss your teeth. And if you go there and you brush 3 times a day and floss twice a day, and you are at the dentist every time you're supposed to be there, and you show up one time after 6 months and you have 27 cavities, you probably feel like you've been lied to. And you feel like, well, this is not right. But for the most part, if you walk in there and you have 5 or 6 cavities, it's because you've neglected going to the dentist. Again, not something I want to preach about. You've neglected going. You don't brush or floss the way you're supposed to, whatever it is. If you go out and you mow your lawn and you're just trudging your way through it, there's a good chance it's because you should have mowed it 2 weeks ago, but instead it's been 6 weeks ago. And so it's suddenly much harder to mow. There are all these truisms in life that we just get. But for whatever reason, when it comes to spiritual things, we forget them altogether. And we forget the fact that, okay, if I'm aware, there are going to be all these good things that come with that. And if I'm unaware, there's consequences that come with it. So there is a negative side to this one. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 3 and verse 1, says that, and to the angel of the church in Sardis write, the words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars, I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive. So if they have the reputation of being alive, this means at least at some point, they are very aware. They know what it is they need to do, and they're doing it. But then he finished the verse with those words we don't like. But you're dead. You knew better, but now you're doing something else, or if you want the terms of dead, you're not doing what you need to be doing at all. Wake up, be aware, and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. Remember then what you have received and heard, keep it and repent. If you will not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. So you did know and you were doing, and then you stopped doing and now you're dead. Wake up, be aware, because if you don't, here's what happens. And I don't know about you, every now and then I'll read something in Scripture that just sends a little bit of a chill up my spine because I don't like reading about that. I know far too many people, and I've probably been guilty of this at one time or another, that know the right thing and have convinced themselves of something else or just walked away from it because it's too hard or because they'd rather do something else. And this is who this speaks to. Wake up, because we're not doing what we need to be doing, and if we don't wake up, then bad things will happen. So a couple Bible stories about awareness that we'll end with, and these look at awareness in 2 very different ways. The first will be more about being aware of the situation going on around you and how often when we are the ones in the midst of it, we're not, and we need somebody else to tell us. The second will deal more with being ready in that sense, as we were just talked about in Revelation, of being ready for judgment when it comes, and the importance of being aware of our situation before God. So the first one is Moses and Jethro in Exodus chapter 18. So Moses basically sits in judgment of the people. And in this sense, they will come to him with disagreements. So if you could imagine, for those of you who are parents, probably somewhere along the way, if you have multiple kids, there may have once or twice been a disagreement between them in your house. I know this is probably unusual, but you've probably somewhere along the way, something got broken, they disagree on who did that. This is somebody's thing, they disagree on who it belongs to or what's supposed to happen or whatever, and they come to you to be the arbitrator of whatever this is. You're now going to be the one who decides what goes and what stays, who is right and who is wrong, all of those things. Moses is dealing with that with a nation. Could you imagine? You know, any of you, even if you manage people at work and you've had to deal with disagreements among coworkers, could you imagine that times millions? Just all of these people coming to you with all of the things they don't agree on. And I wonder, what was this like for Moses, just day after day after day? So the story begins this way. Jethro comes along. He sends word to Moses in Exodus 18 and verse 6. I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. So father-in-law comes to visit. I don't know what your relationship with your in-laws is like. For a lot of you, they're here, so I hope it's good. But you have this relationship with in-laws, and sometimes that's something you look forward to. Sometimes it's something that you don't look forward to. Moses' in-laws show up, and they go into the tent. They're going to talk about what's been going on. So Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. I just imagine this. I like the rare occasions when I can do something to impress my in-laws. I have never brought people across a dry sea or anything like that, and so that would be a great story to tell. But every now and then, if I've done something worthwhile and they're impressed, I think, okay, some mileage coming from this. So Moses tells this story. And he doesn't make himself the hero. He makes God the hero within the story because God is the hero in the story. And he relays all of this to Jethro. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel and that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. And so Moses has got to be feeling like, this is good, okay? I've told this story. My father-in-law likes it. And it really is. We've had hard times and good times, but we know that God is with us and everything is going well. And then he lays out something different. The next day, in verse 13, Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. Whatever the longest meeting you've been into that you thought this could have been an email, Moses has you beat. He has this morning to evening thing that just goes on and on. As he sits judging, I would imagine some very worthwhile disputes and some that he's probably on the inside kind of shaking his head thinking, did you people not have settled this on your own? Did I really? You saw me with the staff back there, you know, parting the sea and all of, I know it was God, but I had the staff. I'm kind of a big deal here. And you're bringing this weird stuff to me. Why? And just person after person after person. So he judges all these disputes. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening? And I would imagine Jethro was probably thinking, how often does this happen? It's like a once a month kind of thing. Do you do this annually? Is this daily? You know, how? And why are you the guy? Why are you the one who's doing this? So Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God when they have a dispute. They come to me and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws. Now I want you to notice something here. I think Moses is not aware at this point. Now, he's aware in the sense that he's described the situation of what's going on pretty well. What he's not aware of is, to a reasonable person, this doesn't make sense. Why would you have one guy who has not been called, by the way, to be the one who settles all the disputes? You know, you go all the way back to Exodus 3 when he is called out of the burning bush, and what God has in mind for him to do, it is not, you're the one who arbitrates all the disputes that are going on. It's you're leading my people out. You're leading them to the promised land, and he has now been tasked with this different job. And so he explains to Jethro what's happening. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, what you're doing is not good. I would imagine everybody has probably heard this from an in-law somewhere along the way, or at least maybe heard it secondhand from an in-law, that what you're doing is just not a good idea. And maybe you have been the in-law to say that to your in-laws somewhere along the way if you've not heard it. But Moses is probably not looking for this reaction. Moses probably feels like, this is one of those things I do, that there is a resolution that comes, and you probably feel good about it, especially men among us, I think for the most part, struggle with some of this. We like to fix things. If there's a problem, we like to solve it. We like to be the one to come up with the solution and make the solution go, and then we like to look at it later and see where it has remained fixed, and you feel like there's an accomplishment there. And I think Moses is struggling with some of that. He gets so much whining and complaining all the time that to fix something probably feels pretty good. But Jethro says, this is not good. This is not good what you're doing, because how can one man keep doing this? How can one person constantly be the arbiter of what's going on? You and the people, verse 18, he says, you and the people will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. And this again, by the way, is one of those places where we understand it when it is physical worldly things, and when it is church godly things, we forget that this is just a truism. Men among us especially, how many times have you picked something up because you thought to yourself, I can pick that up, and then immediately after you've done it, you've realized the large mistake that you have made, especially if you are coming along in age like some of us, and your back cannot handle what it once handled, and then you put whatever it is down and realize you have now messed something up that doesn't need to be messed up. How many times have you taken something on that is too big? How many times have you tried to do something that is not your skill set, that someone else will be so much better equipped to do? And in worldly senses, we see this all the time. But Jethro says, this is a thing of God that you just cannot keep this up. And so he suggests something different. He says, get help. Don't keep doing this on your own, Moses. Get help. So he says, select all these people that are going to help out. In verse 22, he says, let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but small matters they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. Moses, quit doing it on your own. Get these other people to help you. And the added bonus, by the way, is when you do that, you are allowing other people to do. You are building more leaders out there. You are building more people who can act on their feet and act out of wisdom. So he says, basically, work together. Sounds like a pretty godly idea, doesn't it? Teamwork. This is something we should all be doing. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. So one thing to notice before we leave this story behind, Moses' reaction. How easy would it be for us to say, I can do it myself. I got this under control. You don't understand what it would be like if I try to give this to other people, how this will go. He doesn't say any of those things. Instead, rather than being offended or challenged or whatever it may be, he just says, I'll do it. And it works. We find out in the rest of the story, it works. Now, our second story, and we'll bring it all together here, the parable of the watchful servants in Luke chapter, I think I have the wrong chapter down there, chapter 12, not chapter 18. Jesus tells this parable. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. I think one of the many reasons that Jesus uses stories and parables to try to get his point across is what we talked about, the idea that we can so quickly remove spiritual things from the truisms we know of the physical world. The idea of staying dressed and ready for action. When I go to bed at night here in Oklahoma, and there is a threat of severe storms, and there are warnings all around me, but I desperately want to sleep, and I hope all the different alarms that go off and the things that come on your phone will wake me up. On those days, I am sleeping in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt with my shoes next to the bed. I have already pulled my car up far enough in the garage that we can get into the shelter if we need to. I'm not deciding that at 3 in the morning, if I'm woken out of a deep slumber, that I'm going to be functioning well enough to do all of the things at that point. I want to get out of my bed, make sure everybody else is awake, and get in the shelter and be done with it. I just that's how it's supposed to work. Stay dressed for action. When we think of this spiritually, what does this mean? This means we cannot think, I'm going to fix this down the road at some point. I loved hearing, I probably should have asked ahead of time, I loved hearing Bart and Mary talk about Matthew being baptized last week. Matthew did not want to wait. It was not let's do it on this day when these people show up at this place and all this kind of stuff. It was, let's go. What are we waiting for? I think of Scripture. Here is water. What hinders me? I got to go. I got to do this now. When he says to stay dressed for action, he's saying to us, if it is time to be baptized, it is not, let's get all these other ducks in a row first and then get baptized. It's not when I get around to it, I'm going to do this. Or for us who are already followers of his, it is, let's not wait until everything lines up just so to fix this sin problem, to remove ourselves from this temptation, to right this relationship that has gone wrong. Let's not wait until it's the next time we get together or the next time it's convenient. Let's fix these things now. And so he says, stay dressed for action, keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Be aware and be ready. And these two are pretty much the same when it comes to salvation. Be aware of what needs to be done and then do it. Don't wait for the right time to come later. Don't wait until everything is just so. Don't wait until I just want to do whatever this is one last time and then fix it. Fix it now. Change it now. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. He is coming back, and what he is looking for when he does is a people that are ready to go. Not a people that see Jesus coming and panic. Not a people that see Jesus coming and say, I was hoping it would be tomorrow. But a people that are ready to go. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. Don't think it's going to be here or here or here. Don't let, if he comes back before we meet again, don't let that just be a tagline in the prayer. He could very well come back before we meet again, or you could be gone, or I could be gone before we meet again. Fix whatever needs to be fixed today. Those who are aware and take action are blessed. And this is where it connects. It's not just those who are aware. It is great to know the right things. It is great to know what God says in Scripture. It is great to have a knowledge of that, to memorize, to anything you do with that. Good to know the answers. But much better to know the answers and then to take action based on those answers. To do the right things. To be who we are called to be. And then he says this, but know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. I've often wondered, having that storm shelter there in my garage, when is the right Oklahoma etiquette time to actually get inside that thing? I have thought many times, okay, is it when there's a tornado warning in Pontotoc County? Because for some reason, those are always the north or the south part of the county. They're never us. So do I get in it anyway? Do I wait until I can hear the train? Because all I can hear in Ada is trains. And so I don't know if that's going to be it. Do I wait until I see the trees starting to blow sideways? Do I get in there and everyone laughs at me later for why were you in there? I don't know what the right thing is. But what he's looking for is people that regardless of the time, regardless of the circumstance, are ready to go. I try to imagine what would it be like to be standing next to my house that is gone and to be just completely disheveled, and people say, don't you have a storm shelter? And to say, yeah. Didn't you go in it? No. How silly would that be? And yet, that's how people treat God so often. I thought I'd have more time to fix this and to get it ready. You must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. And that, by the way, that's the key to awareness. You must be aware because you don't know the situation. You don't know how it will develop. Thinking back to Jason Bourne in those movies, he doesn't know which one of those cars in the parking lot is a problem, if any. He doesn't know if he's going to need to exit or not. There's a good chance he doesn't, and everything will be fine. As I was telling my wife that story, because we've watched that movie together a couple times, she mentioned to me when she was a college student, the bombing happened in Oklahoma City. And she was, during that time, driving her car frequently from Searcy, Arkansas to Nebraska, where her grandfather's farm is. And as she would drive through Oklahoma, she found herself memorizing the license plates that were on rental trucks. Because everybody remembers that story of the Ryder truck and all of that stuff. And she's an accountant and she knows numbers. And so she would literally start memorizing license plates just in case, one of those things. And my guess is there was probably never any need for any of that, but it was the thing she was trying to do to be aware of what was going on. I would be very content if the entire time I live in Oklahoma, I never have to set foot in that storm shelter during a storm. I'm A-okay with that. I will still look at it as money well spent. I use it, by the way, to change my oil, which is a lot of fun. But if I never have to go in there for a storm, great, all good. But it's there. For us, we may all live and die before Jesus returns, or we may not. For us, we may all live out all of the things we have planned for retirement, all the places we want to go, all the things we want to do and see, and we may not. For us, we may live out all of that time where we think, I'm going to get really involved in this thing in church at this point, and there are a lot of people that do that, and there are a lot of people that never get there. Or for us, we may live to the point that we make those relationships right, that we get away from the sin that tempts us, we do the right things, or we may not. And for all of us, Jesus would say, be ready. So tonight, if you're not aware, I hope you are now. And if you're not ready, I hope you will begin to act on the awareness that you have and change that. I hope you'll follow him tonight, be baptized into him. Or if you need to come back to him, if you have treated this too much like something you'll fix at some point when you get around to it, this is the around to it. You're here. This is the time to fix it. This is the time to make it right. Let us help you with that as we stand and as we sing.